Hi, everyone, and welcome to our fourth workshop of the day. Jane Xiao is here to teach us about accessibility first. Jane is the principal of Experience Design at Slalom Build, a consulting company in the tech space, and she has experience in social science and architecture to help make a difference in people's lives today. Thank you, Jane, for being here with us today.
Thanks for that introduction, Chloe. Before I get started, do we want to give people a little bit more time to join, or do we want to get started, Charles and Chloe?
We can give it a second, but if you want to start, maybe just introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe where you're.
Sure. I'm going to add a little bit to Chloe's story. As you can see, I'm an avid reader. I have varied interests. It includes Ghibli production, Harry Potter, all the things. I'm very much a millennial. But what's close and dear to my heart in accessibility is just experiencing some of that in my own personal life. And you'll hear a couple of anecdotes once I start doing my presentation. I think it's actually really funny how we don't see accessibility as related to us, but it's very much related to everybody. And so I hope at the end of this presentation, you're not only more familiar with what accessibility is, but you also see what accessibility in the project looks like. So I'm very excited to share that with all of you. Cool. If we're ready, I can get us started, and then anybody else who joins us in the meantime can also watch the recording afterwards and catch up. Sounds good? Okay. As predicted, Charles, no one's on their screens, or none of them are on. And so it's just the two of your faces I get to see, but that's okay. We're going to use emojis. If you're not comfortable jumping on screen, no worries whatsoever. So first of all, before we jump in, can I get an emoji reaction of those who are familiar with accessibility and what it is, just to gauge my audience? Okay, Charles, looks like you are. Hannah as well. Max, Eben, Rocio, Evan, Devika. Cool, very cool. Sounds like quite a few of you guys are pretty familiar. So that's actually great. So some of you will learn something new, and then hopefully what I'll present will expand your knowledge of accessibility moving forward. So let's get started. So what is accessibility? I actually split up accessibility and another definition just so that I can expand on it. If we're talking about accessibility, it's a general practice of empathy where we consider the navigation not only of web users, but also day-to-day life users as a consideration of the actions or the decision that we make. So it's very much an empathetical practice, not tied to any practice like design or development or engineering. None of it has to matter. Everybody should do it. And then there's accessible design, which is taking that empathy and doing something with it in terms of the decision you make when it comes to your products that you create. It's making sure that you're considering the disability needs in order to serve those individuals. And that's in the services you provide, the facility you provide, and the products that you build. And when I say design, I don't mean designers. I mean design as a product creation. And so it's not only designers who owns the accessibility field. It is involved, it's everybody who's involved in the product creation cycle. So that includes people like designers, developers, solution owners, engineers, quality engineers. Everybody that produces a product can take part and take ownership in that space. It's very much a team sport. We're going to do a little quiz again. Out of these three people that you see on the screen, who has disability? Use your emojis. If you think it's Professor X, it's a thumbs up. If you think it's Mariah Carey, do a little heart. And if you think it's Elon Musk, do a little clap. Cool. Charles, I see some thumbs ups. Okay, a lot of thumbs ups. Okay, majority of y'all are thumbs up. So in the estimate, Professor X is what we all kind of understand as a disabled person. But I'm going to tell you something surprising. All three of them are disabled because disability isn't so much a person's status in their physical health. It's actually much more than that. If I can switch the screen. There we go. Disability is not a personal health condition. It's actually human interactions and experiences. And so in the definition that you guys might be familiar with, it comes from 1980. So in the last 40 years, the understanding of disability and accessibility has expanded. A lot of time it's disability related to a group of people, or it's disability related to a society as a whole, the environment that you're in, or physical environment that you're actually interacting with. And of course, now that we have the World Wide Web and computer and screens are such an embedded part of our lives, that's also a really important part of accessibility that we need to consider, where disability plays a part. So here's the categories of disability. Our original understanding of disability is in that top column, top row of permanent disability related to touch, your motor skills, your hearing, your sightedness, your ability to speak or be verbal, or your cognition. So it's related to things like dyslexia. But disability can be also temporary, related to injuries. So you could potentially have an arm injury that causes you to have disability for a short while. And then it can be situational. It could be caused because you have your hands full, you're at the grocery store, you can't use your hands. So now you're disabled in that situation, and you need accessible ways of interacting with whatever you're trying to interact with. Same thing for hearing. A good example of that would be you're in an airplane. The person on the speaker is trying to speak to you. The airplane is super loud. You can't really hear what the instruction they're providing. So oftentimes on certain airplanes, there'll be a screen in front of you with closed captioning. Great. It's not only really good for people who has disability, permanent disability, but as somebody who's situationally deaf in that moment, that's also accessibility that we should consider, that improves the experience of the user as well. So some of us have all been disabled more or less in our daily lives. We just don't realize it because we don't define it that way. Certain technologies has to be considered when we're building something accessible. And now we're kind of going back into the tech space where if we're building an experience for the digital product, what are the technologies that we need to make sure to consider to assist for disability? For somebody who is blind, there's two tools that is used, screen readers and Braille applications. And both applications can be used, but has to be learned. And so there is a learning curve. So we're going to talk a little bit about persona as well. There's different kinds of blind individual as well. And that might influence their comfort level with these applications and whether or not we build heavily for these tools as well. For somebody with low vision, this is often something you can be born with, but it's also something you grow into as you age. So our grandparents were slowly losing their eyesight, unable to see a screen because it has to be zoomed in. I'm in my 30s, and I can tell you I'm starting to zoom in on my screen now, especially how much I use the screen. My eyes are getting really tired sometimes. And so that zoom in effect, the ability to do that on your application, on your computer, whether that's on a Windows or on a Mac, those are accessibility considerations. So both company does a pretty good job of considering that. Same thing for your browsers. When you're able to zoom in to 100%, 130, 200, those are consideration of use cases when you're designing for accessibility as well. And aside from the sightedness of accessibility, there's also motor accessibility. So for somebody who has no use of their hands and their arms, often the way to actually access a device is through a switch control, which is controlled by your mouse. And you're using it to kind of navigate the website through that manner. And this type of user will not have the ability to use the mouse. And then the other type of accessibility is closed captioning. And here the persona blends. It could be closed captioning a requirement because the person is hard of hearing or deaf, which is a permanent disability, or you're watching a foreign film, where you're actually trying to understand what's on the screen, and without closed captioning, you're prevented from actually accessing content that might be available to native speakers. And so that type of accessibility will come up as well as consideration. And closed captioning is a major requirement for a lot of things. And in a little bit, I'm going to talk about a company who's actually been sued because they did not have a closed captioning. So accessibility isn't just a empathy. We don't do it because it's just nice. It's also required by law. In 1990, the Disability Act, Title III, included website and application are considered as places of public service. So not allowing users to use it because of their disability is like an entrance to a building does not have a wheelchair ramp, so somebody cannot access that building. And so these are things that companies can be sued for. And the reason why there's a domino pizza on your screen is because one of the examples is in 2016, Domino Pizza's website was actually sued because a blind man wasn't able to order Domino Pizza from their website. Because the website is inaccessible and inaccessible to a screen reader. So the user actually didn't have a way of interacting with it. And other companies has gone through this too in other ways. Netflix was sued in 2012 because they lacked closed captioning. And that's on the early stages of Netflix offering online streaming. So as a company, they were learning the requirements of accessibility when it comes to video access as well. Nike in 2017 was sued for the lack of support on their website for screen readers. Amazon was sued in 2018 for accessibility. Five Guys Burger and Fries in 2017. Beyonce's company, which was a big public case for it, Parker Entertainment in 2019 was actually sued because their website was inaccessible for a blind user when they're trying to order a concert ticket. So these things are great examples and great motivations for a company nowadays when they're considering building their website. It's no longer a nice to have to build accessible. It's actually a requirement, and it creates a competitive environment where people who do not build accessible is actually going to do worse business-wise. Before we get to this next section of where I'll talk about sort of where accessibility goes into a real life example at my work, is there any question for the last section? And feel free to go on. Are we good? Is that a thumbs up? No questions? Okay, cool. Well, if you have any questions, post in the chat. Charles and Chloe are helping me monitor the chat, so I can definitely answer them between these sections. Okay, in practice. So as mentioned before, accessibility goes beyond digital products, but because my personal experience of working with accessibility or thinking about designing for accessibility has very much been primarily in digital world. So I'll be talking about that for the majority. Some things that as I go into a project, I consider is there are guidelines. It's never you find out what the user actually needs and then you determine what is accessible. There's actually 50A and WCAG guidelines that gets updated yearly just to make sure that the understanding of what's considered accessible, what is a rule, is part of that contract or expectation from the client. On projects where I've worked with a federal client or a financial client, this is especially important. It's often the first thing they write into their contracts is our products, whatever we design or redesign will have to be 508 compliant. And in other projects where it's not a rule, it's up to the team and to Slalom to say, accessibility is a necessity now. Even if you're not asking for it, let's bill for it because that's a great rule of thumb. WCAG guideline has been updated to 2.1. Generally in the 2.1, 2, 3, it would be addition to what's already published in 2.0. And the compliance levels are generally going to be either AA or AAA. There's rarely any company that will say a single A is enough as a compliance. And there's more company that will say AA is good enough. rather than requiring for a AAA compliance, which is a lot harder to comply to. So there are several different guidelines within WCAG applying to different disabilities. So it's up to us when we go onto a project to create a checklist for us to understand what these criteria might be. One example of that would be the use of color. And I think this goes into just how we design day to day anyways. If I have a blue background and I put red text on top of it, you guys are going to be so dizzy because that's inaccessible to everyday users even. But even more for somebody who's low vision, you might have to consider things like color contrast because of color blindness, or the fact that if something isn't contrasted enough, it blurs into the background for a low vision user. You're just extra intentional when you're doing these designs where these things were already considerations of what you do. And there are things Slalom does on our projects in order to support the team in getting certificates to be a better representative of our accessible requirements. And often these are on federal projects where it's a necessity for us to deliver this way. In our sprints, we often have one single sprint dedicated to innovation. And during that time, it's up to our team members to decide if they want to take time to study up on their 508 requirements and be able to get an actual certificate for it. This is very time consuming. Full transparency, I've not gotten this, but I've learned a lot just working on accessibility with our clients. And accessibility is very much owned by different roles. So I'm going to talk about now the different ways. Slalom actually breaks our capabilities and collaborates as capabilities and which capability owns what. Slalom Build itself is structured where even though we're consultants in tech, we're not embedded as individuals onto a project or into a client team. We're actually embedded as a pod. So that pod itself will take ownership for a feature within that contract. And often that pod will include experience designers, software engineers, quality engineers, and solution owners. As designers, we're the first one that gets to know the user's needs. And so when we build the design, we make sure accessibility is considered where visual front-end items are considered. But we're also thinking about our engineering collaborators. What do they need from us to understand tabbing order? What are the texts that's needed in the alt text when it involves an image on the page? So there's a lot of collaboration very closely between the different groups. And software engineers will have their own checklist. And that checklist is often very technical and very focused on what is the experience of somebody who's not sighted and will require additional information to be read out that might not be visual, but actually needs to be read by a screen reader. And quality engineers are those with expertise. Often they are able to think of scenarios that the rest of the team member have not thought of, and they're able to test that out for the rest. And solution owners just make sure when we're on a large program where there's multiple pods, we're not repeating work. So if a pod is focusing on something that could be consumed by somebody else, like a component in a design system, the solution owner can manage that roadmap and make sure that we're able to share between pods. And this could be true if we're embedded on a team that is the client's team, but we're individual pod that we're sharing with our client as well, so that there is a true team collaboration between all of us. So as a designer, as mentioned, the first thing we could do is create a design system. And that design system will already be taking into consideration all the necessities when it involves accessibility. And so you're building components that could be consumed on other parts of the website where you don't have to rebuild it over and over again. These design systems don't usually start from scratch unless it's necessary for that particular client. Sometimes we'll take existing design systems and build on top of it. So for a federal project, the website for USCIS, not USCIS, US Web Design System is used by the federal government. So it's already got components where we can start consuming and just make implementations, adjustments to it, depending on the project itself. Material design is a great example of an often used design system as a starting point for a lot of projects. Salesforce has a design system, and it has a section specifically talking about accessibility, as well as Workday's Canvas design system. So if you guys want to learn more about design system as a whole and how accessibility has been considered by different companies, go to their design system, which usually is public, and go to their accessibility section, and you can start learning some of the rules that they've set up and the learnings that they have kind of produced through their own interactions with building accessible. And so when it comes to developers and engineers, there's checklists like, do all the image have alternative text, which is referred to as alt text? Do all heading levels follow a proper outline hierarchy? Because a screen reader user will actually go from heading to heading. So H1 is the primary focus, where it groups H2 and the body text. And so they're thinking a very logical way and very linear way of thinking about a page. And we need to make sure that the page is set up to service that. This is tied into just designing hierarchy very clearly, which is already part of UX design as a whole. It's communication between the development team and also the UX team to make sure that we have an outline hierarchy within that design system for consistency across the product that we're producing. Do all the data tables have correct header designation? Because if I jump to row 3, column 3, do I know what that column is and what information is being read to me? Those are considerations that the screen would need to read out, but it might not be visible because as a sighted user, you're able to scan and see that. Is all link text appropriately descriptive? On a page where you have links that keeps on saying, read more, read more, read more. For a sighted user, you're able to see the read more is tied or associated with the content above it. As a screen reader user, you're jumping from link to link. And so if it all says read more, you have no idea which link you're going to. And so the request often is, be more descriptive, like read more about the title of the actual content that they're about to go into. A differentiation like that will help them navigate a lot easier. Do all the videos have closed captioning, especially if the page does have videos? And this is very true. And closed captioning is more for the deaf users than the sighted users or non-sighted users. Can all links and navigation drop-down function for users who does not have access to a mouse? So that's considering those who has motor issues, but also somebody who actually uses a screen reader will not use a mouse. Often their keyboard navigation is primary way of actually navigating a page, the tabbing, the logic, all of that. And then does the site use ARIA tags, which is ARIA, it's spelled ARIA. It's landmarks specifically built into the code that would read to a screen reader. It's not visible, but it does the job of further explaining the material that they're looking at. For example, on a page with a search field, that field might be relatively simple in visuals, but it needs to explain what you're searching to the blind user so that they're easier to understand what's the page action that will be taken when they actually search using that field. And so generally it starts with a prioritization assessment and the checklist. And the prioritization assessment helps the team make decisions on what's a major fix. If we don't pass this, we need to fix this. And what's a minor fix, which is if we don't have this, that can be pushed back in the backlog and we can address it in the future sprint. And then check off that list as we're doing the project to make sure that we're all on board on the things that we need to cover. And so the other part of working on an accessible project where I feel like we don't always consider is your client is your resource, because often when they're requesting for accessibility, they have a better understanding of the end user than you do coming onto the project. So oftentimes when I am on a project, I go to the client first to see if they will let us speak with the end users. If that's not possible, then who's the stakeholder on their team who are SMEs of the user's experience that I can come into contact with? On a past federal project I was working on, that's exactly what happened. We were hip to hip with the client, working not only on designing, but also validating those designs within sprints so that we can actually build an experience that the end user would enjoy. And this is often important as somebody going into a project less familiar with a user type, like a blind user. What's the best way of understanding a user's need? Because you're building for sighted users at first. This is a great way to do that. And through that project, I actually learned there's things a blind user would think about a page. As a user, my mind is not doing in that moment when I first started the design process. So learning the new logic, new consideration builds over time, and my expertise reduce the amount of back and forth between our work and the client's communication, which improves the velocity of a sprint over time, which is really great. And this kind of back and forth collaboration is very iterative, just like everything within building a technological product. You improve on the process in order to improve the way that we deliver as well. So some of the lessons I learned from building a product specifically for blind and visually impaired users. So this is very unique. Generally, you're building a website for sighted users with consideration for accessibility. The project I was on was actually building specifically for those who are blind and visually impaired. Those with low vision will miss right aligned content because they're so zoom in on the page, they don't often go all the way to the other side of the page. So for them, it's actually prefer if everything is left aligned, so they just have to go down rather than all the way to the side, all the way back, which makes perfect sense, but I didn't know until I started speaking with a low vision user. They do not like white space. And as designers, we are often saying white space is great. It gives you a place for your eyes to rest because the page needs to be chunked, the contents need to be separated. But when you're designing specifically for those who are blind or visually impaired, how does that kind of play into their experience? And especially if you're building a website where the magnifying of the page doesn't reduce the amount of white space that's on the page, then that white space can actually be misleading. They could be at the bottom of a content. There's more underneath it. They don't know because there's so much white space. And so for that type of user, it's a lot of guesswork. What did I miss? What's actually here that I need to consider? Underlining of links, especially if something breaks because of a comma or a drop G. We've heard very specific feedbacks, and this is another thing we didn't know until we experienced it. They consider as two separate links. It's not apparent to them that it's a single link. So we had to adjust our code where the padding between the underline and the text above it was separated enough so that it's clear that this is a single link and it's not broken into two. So things that we learned on this very unique project. And our low vision users comes in different forms. You could have somebody who is colorblind or see very specific zoom in sizes and require bigger or smaller text. And so in those cases, building a website that is actually personalizable for that type of user is preferred. There are some low vision users who might be very sensitive to light. So having a white background and a lot of white background is actually very disturbing to their eyes. So they might prefer a dark mode. Not a lot of website will build to it, but that is a consideration when building a website. And then here is what I was talking about when I was saying there's different types of blind users. What we discovered on this project was there are those who are born blind, which makes them power users of assistive technology because they have had their lifetime to learn it. So whether that's a screen reader or a Braille display, Braille itself, just like sign language, is very much a new language that you have to learn. So the other type of blind users are those who became blind with age or through accidents, etc. And so for them, learning a new piece of technology is especially hard. If you think about our grandparents, they're not very technologically savvy, at least mine aren't. And so if you're asking them to also learn a piece of new technology like screen reader or Braille, that's not going to happen. So when designing for these folks, you have to think, I'm designing not just for them, I'm designing for their family members and friends who are helping out. So I'm designing now for sighted users. Or I'm designing for an experience of the website where it's just the keyboard navigation of tabbing. So how can I make that easy for them so that they don't have to rely on assistive technology to access the website? So some of the things we learn from our blind users, linear tabbing is the preferred way to go, just because complex web pages that a sighted user might be used to is actually really hard for them to imagine in their heads. So if you close your eye and you're trying to understand what's on the page, you're chunking information. It's really difficult to be able to look at all of the page and make sense of it without some kind of chunking experience. So that's where the heading navigation comes in very much. So if something is at an H1, they understand that's the header for the whole page. And then if you go to a header 3 instead of a header 2, they'll be wondering, did I miss something on the page? So consistency of the heading naming standards is really important for these users as well. And often those who are power users, they don't actually go through the whole page to find something. If they're trying to take action like download a specific book, they'll actually use a shortcut within Screen Reader called links list. And they'll use a search box to actually find the link through typing it and then click on it. So there are shortcut experiences that we weren't aware of, but does support a better experience for a blind user on a website that should be considered. They always prefer to have a confirmation page so that they know some action has happened, but that confirmation has to be its own page, not a modal, because modal is very finicky when it comes to actually focusing using a screen reader. If it focuses underneath the modal, there's no way of getting out of it. So often blind user will get stuck if there is a modal on the page that's not built right. So the way that we were instructed by our client was, let's just do a page. And I don't mind that it's a new page rather than a modal experience. Always need to some form of confirmation for the action they're taking. So if somebody is making an error on the field that they're filling out, the page would need to refocus, and their screen system needs to be able to read that they're in a different location of the page, and here's the error message to tell you what went wrong. You can't fully rely on a visual notification. And if nothing happens on the page, sometimes as a sighted user, we get confused too. So it's the same way. You're just building for sound or focus when it comes to building for blind users. They're also very slow to adapt to new changes because, just like mentioned before, adapting to new technology is already taking a lot of work, and having to rethink about it, reforming those mental models in their minds, that's really difficult. So we have to consider when we're building new websites or redesigning a new website, the way that we build it will have to be similar enough that they don't feel completely thrown off the loop. And also something to consider is training might be the way to go, right? If you have to introduce a new experience, maybe it's not that you don't innovate, it's that you have to build in a system prior to them adapting to this product, so that they can actually learn and feel more comfortable doing this on their own. Pluralization in grammar and the use of what copy is on the page is important to a screen reader. Things that might appear really natural as we're reading it with our eyes is because our brain does the job of fixing it. However, screen reader will not fix a misspelling. They will not fix something like a quotation mark with an S. They'll read it exactly as it is. And sometimes that's very confusing because it's not read in the correct way. So testing with a screen reader as part of our process was actually necessary. And because on our project, none of the teammates actually uses a screen reader, what we did was build it out and then test it with our blind stakeholders so that they can actually make sure that they understand what we're writing. And if there's something that we need to fix, we just went back and fixed it. As you learn and work together, you kind of realize there are certain rules to it, and you just make sure the next time you're building something, you're implementing those rules as well. And when you're consolidating information, where you're creating information, you have to think in filters and in drop downs. the navigation that a blind user uses is often first letter navigation. So something that might feel grammatically correct, like only English, only French, will not be very navigationable if you're relying on a keyboard. And so that was one thing we learned in the filter. Instead of saying things like only English, it became English only. Or on a drop down, maybe only is not even necessary. English is enough. And that's exactly what we kind of implemented on our project as well. So I see there might be some comments in the chat. So feel free to kind of shoot them at me.
Yeah, we'll open up for questions for Jane. I will allow everyone to, well, everyone's allowed to unmute. So feel free to raise your hand and ask a question or put something in the chat. I'd like to kick us off with a quick question for Jane. In terms of, well, I guess this is more kind of a hypothetical, and if it's not a straight answer, don't worry about it. But in terms of like when users are experiencing either just a website or an app or something like that, how common do you think it is for the website or app to have a feature that allows people to request certain accessibility features to be included or added to their experience? So if they're having trouble using the website, something like that, my first thought is I haven't seen a lot of websites that do that make it more accessible or make it effort to allow people to do that. You probably have to go through like contact or whatever. But anyways, wanted to hear your experiences or your thoughts on it.
Great question. And I think a lot of websites relies very heavily on the browser to do it because there are browser plugins and of course Chrome or, well, I primarily use Chrome, so I'll use that as an example. Zooming in on a web page, that's already been done for you. Reversing colors isn't something that very often happens, but our computer has a native reaction to dark mode or light mode. So if a application is built in a certain way where it respects that change on your computer, that just happens naturally. So I think companies sometimes will fall back on these crutches. Where I've seen products actually having those abilities has been rare, just like you said, Charles. But if you go to governmental websites, that's actually becoming prominent. That's actually becoming a requirement. I think, where was it? I think on the website for Social Security, if you go to that website, it actually has a toggle for changing the page color and the size of the font. So that's already starting. And I know there's a couple of applications I've used at restaurants to order during the COVID transition where that assistive technology was also used. But it's more for like the colorblind or low vision users. Those assistive technology hasn't been really a built-in experience as much for most of the websites, for sure. Great question.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I hadn't even thought of the government websites that you mentioned, but that is a great example. And I think that's really cool that they're, I think, of course, the most important websites to have them. So it's great to hear that they're moving in that direction.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Blair. Hi, Jane. I was a bit late to this meeting, so you might have mentioned it at the beginning, but I wanted to ask, how did you get interested in working with accessibility in this field in general?
Thank you for asking that question. I'll answer the question about accessibility first, because I think how I got interested in this field actually is a very long answer. I was actually fortunate enough at as an in-house designer at AIG, being voluntold to do accessibility just because that became a requirement. In 2019, our company was actually sued for being not accessible. And so the company took it very personally and made it a requirement for all the products teams to focus on accessibility. So I got to experience it through doing, but it aligns with my core value of doing right through my design. And so learning this has become something that kind of wrote into future projects where if it's not requested of me, I'm still considering it, where I'm almost an expert within accessibility within my company. I was able to be placed onto my current project because I had past accessibility experiences. In terms of how I got into UX, goodness, I actually originally wanted to become an architect, especially interior architecture, because I wanted to change space and create an environment for people where they felt certain emotions, and that felt powerful to me. But of course, life happens, and you realize architecture doesn't pay that well. So I'm going to be realistic. Like when you're considering making a living and being an adult, what are my alternatives where it combines a combination of my passions? And I've always played around with HTML and CSS on my own. And I knew I was really interested in people and changing in products for people. And so when I realized UX was a field that I could transition into, that's what I did. So I took boot camps, I volunteered, I did internships, and I was able to transition into UX for a different field I was working in.
Thank you for that answer. Great summary of your experiences. As someone who once wanted to be an architect very long ago, that was very empowering to hear from you. And the comment from the asker was, thank you for answering, very inspiring. I think it's really important for us to focus on core values when career searching. So
Absolutely.
Your words are resonating. I had one other question before we get into, and again, everyone feel free to keep sharing your questions in the chat. One thing for the participants here this weekend that are going to be building their project, it is kind of a design sprint in a sense, because they only have a certain amount of time to do things. For putting out a project in that short amount of time, what's one of the, you listed so many different ways that we can be more accessible and provide more accessibility in our designs. What's one of the main big things that you can think of that you think students should maybe, or like a good kind of quick thing to do if they're doing a short designathon like this, to show that they're putting an effort towards accessibility or thinking about accessibility in their design without being able to accommodate for all of the different things that they can?
Great question. And this kind of ties into what you will have to consider anyways, which is, who are you building for, right? The first question you ask is, why am I building this and who's using it? And then that kind of guides you into the decisions that you make. And so persona, understanding the type of users that you're servicing, and then being able to design towards it. I actually have within the sources, I'm happy to share this deck afterwards, links to websites where it has descriptors of personas related to accessibility, so that if you're reading on that this week and you're considering your product and you're thinking, does this persona need to be addressed by my product? Yes. Then how do I do that, right? Being able to do that in very simple terms of like contrast, that's an easy way to make sure your page is accessible. In terms of your alt text, all the checklist items that I mentioned, I think those are easy things to implement in a way that makes a difference. But it's also, how can you tell this story? And this might be a little towards the end of your sprint. Once you actually built your product, how do you tell the story of where accessibility came in? And so if you can start thinking about that story, it might actually guide you in terms of how you're building up your products.
It's a really great answer. Thank you so much, Jane. I'm sure very valuable for everyone here that's working on projects this weekend. We have another question from Hannah. Hannah says, there are usually a lot of components and moving parts to designing something. Do you have any advice to setting up a system to consider the accessibility of during the process of designing, so that it isn't an afterthought?
Yeah, so start with that checklist, right? Once you understand what the WCAG expectations are for the type of user that you're designing for, creating that checklist is a great way of lining yourself, but also your team to what needs to be done. And so once you have that, it's a guideline, a North Star for the whole team in terms of accessibility. But the other place where accessibility can become not an afterthought is in your design systems. When you're creating those components or you're already thinking about it, then that doesn't need to be repeated. It's done once and it's already consumed everywhere on the website where it's accessible. So it reduces the amount of time you're spending, the whole team, you designing and the developer developing on that product itself.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that answer. And especially with the design systems, I'm sure a lot of teams are putting together their palettes and their fonts and everything. So to include accessibility in that, I think this is the perfect time to do so. I'm sure a lot of teams might be in the process of that now.
Great tool to use if you're using Figma. And I think Sketch also has this plugin called Contrast. And what it does will actually tell you if your text on that background or vice versa is AA or AAA accessible. And often I'll get a AA approval and then doesn't pass AAA. I'm like, that's good enough. Yeah.
That's super cool. Thank you so much. Before we move on to any other questions, would you like to go? I don't know if you already showed all of the slides here with the resources, but if you wanted to share
Not, but it's just a couple of things that I may have mentioned, like here's some guidelines and resources where you can type into where Apple has addressed accessibility, Google, Microsoft, all of these places. So that's a great resource to reference this weekend and beyond it. But if you're using a design tool and that is something you're focusing on this during this weekend, here's the tools that you can reference. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. So we'll give it one more see if anyone has any questions. And feel free to unmute as well. We'll give it a minute to see, just in case people are typing. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you again so much, Jane. This has been so great to hear from you and to learn so much about accessibility, especially when it comes to design, UI, UX, all of that, and your story, your journey to getting here. I think you inspired a lot of people and really helped everyone build their own skills, especially when it comes to helping others and making a difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you guys for having me.
Getting a thank yous in the chat, so we appreciate it. This Zoom recording will be available to everyone later on in the weekend, and our final workshop is coming up later at 5 p.m. EST, so come back for that. But thank you again, Jane, for being here, and thank you everyone for stopping by and enjoying the presentation.
Have a good weekend, y'all.